When I started this podcast, I said I was going to bring you guests. And today it's the first of those guests. And what a start it's going to be. General David Petraeus is a very distinguished military officer, former director of the CIA, distinguished and capable and ongoing academic, and an amazing man to talk to. He's now the chairman of the KKR Global Institute. He's a partner at KKR in the United States, and he's a member of a whole range of different boards and still very, very active academically. He spoke to me at some length. I've left the interview largely unedited because I think he brings so many fantastic insights against the questions that I asked him when he talks about his own career. He shares some leadership models that he's used over the years and is incredibly candid about some of the things that have happened to him and his own experiences. I think it's a terrific way to start with a very, very distinguished senior leader who has masses to share and masses of things that actually I think you can pick up on. So I really hope you enjoy this interview. I'm Bob Judson. You're listening to Leading for Life Stories. And without further ado, let's get on with it. Well, General, I can't tell you what a privilege it is to have you here today. I really, very, very grateful for your time. You've got a fantastic career, both in the military and post the military, and you could not be a better guest for me. And I'm extremely grateful to have you here today. So first and foremost, thanks very much for that. I know you're a very busy guy, and I really, really appreciate your time.
Great to be with you, Bob, and thanks for what you did in your years, decades of service as well, especially, frankly, in the post 9/11 wars that we both were so engaged in during that time.
Thanks. It was certainly made for an interesting career. I mean, when I look back on it, I just can't believe some of the stuff and the change, actually, starting out in the Cold War to then go through to as you say, post 9/11 and everything that went on from that, which was extraordinary. So, General, the first thing I'd really like to ask you about is how you shaped and adjusted your own leadership style across the whole of your career, and particularly in the transition you've made from years and years of military service out into the civilian world.
Well, it's a great question, Bob. I think that leadership style has to evolve constantly, whether you're just from one position, one unit, one organization, in uniform to a completely civilian organization, say the CIA or the private sector. I think you always have to ask yourself, what is the leadership style that will bring out the best in each of those who directly report to me individually? And then what is the style that will bring out the best in that organization that you're privileged to lead collectively? And it varies. If you think about, my very first assignment in the Army was as a second lieutenant rifle platoon leader in an airborne battalion combat team in Vicenza, Italy. That's a romp and stomp and follow me, do as I do, very visceral, very physical, literally constantly leading from the front. As the old saying goes, it's hard to lead from the rear of the formation. So it's all about your example. It's about the inspiration that you provide, the encouragement, and all the rest of that. But even within that, there were individuals that worked directly for me, and they responded to different stimuli, to different leadership styles, if you will. As you progress in the military, as you well know, you become, say, a company commander, battalion commander, even especially, I think, a brigade commander, where for the first time, your direct reports, those working directly for you, battalion commanders, are only a few years younger than you are. They're quite experienced. And so, again, that takes a different leadership style than leading a bunch of squad leaders or privates or lieutenants or what have you. And then as you progress further in our Army, for the first time, all of a sudden, there are females in the ranks. There are aviators. You know how aviators are, having been one. They occasionally have a touch of ego with them. So that requires at times a slightly different leadership style. Special operators, and then special mission unit. And again, it just goes on and on. So I think you have to constantly ask yourself that question that I posed: what's the style that will bring out the best in each of the direct reports individually and the organization collectively? And that's what you try to demonstrate, to practice, and so forth. noting that sometimes you can be leading an organization that has parts that actually require different leadership styles. If you think of the CIA, for example, you have we used to have the 4 big Ds. We made it 5th one when I was there, the Directorate of Operations. These are the spies, the clandestine services officers. I've spent a lot of time with them close up, a lot of the station chiefs and others during the decade following 9/11 in particular, but I also had experience with them prior to that. Then you have the much more cerebral, the analysts, in my day, the Director of Intelligence, now of Analysis. And these are very academic. And actually, I was helped considerably by having been an academic, having gotten a PhD at a great university and actually taught international relations and economics, et cetera. So I enjoyed that back and forth, much more intellectual exchange, and occasionally good debate. That's what you want to foster. That's the style and you have to build, again, their pride in their own culture. Which is, again, a slightly different culture, obviously, from that of those in the clandestine services, and especially within that, the special activities division. Then there's the science and tech guys, if you will, and they have their own culture. And it's all about, again, remember from the James Bond movies, they love creating these diabolically clever items of technology and so forth. And then the Directorate of Support, which has a number of different elements in it. And once again, you have to get that particular style right. By the way, you have the world's best metal benders, the best woodworkers, the best design disguise artists, the best of everything, really. It's an extraordinary workforce. And then we added a 5th big D, which is increasingly dealing with the digital transformation, tradecraft in a world of ubiquitous surveillance, the IT side of things, fusion of intelligence, massive quantities of data. Again, how do you do that? And so again, it's another whole group of people, very technically expert, way beyond just sort of the connectivity and signals and that kind of activity communications. This is about, again, mountains of data, and figuring out how it is that we can pull a digital needle out of these mountains in various missions that we're carrying out. So again, this is not a simple task. One style does not fit all. You have to evolve constantly, even within a particular career path, say within the military, much less when you get into the private sector. And you have to understand the context. In the military, even there, I would say that if you're relying on the deference to higher rank, if you are the now hear this kind of leader, that may not be all that successful. Oftentimes, if you can't persuade people of the wisdom of your big ideas and your strategy and so forth, perhaps there's a flaw in the big ideas. So you want the kind of culture that is a learning organization and where they don't feel threatened by challenging the boss, the commander, the whatever. And the same is true in the private sector. It's obviously somewhat different, as you well know from your own experience in that sector over the last nearly a decade. But obviously not as hierarchical, much more matrixed, a bit more familiar, if you will. But again, you just have to understand that context, understand the individuals. My experience at KKR has been extraordinary. It's really the most exceptional workforce with which I've ever been privileged to serve. Incredibly bright, no jerks, but individuals that won't hesitate to offer their views and do so in a very considered, thoughtful, and reasonable manner.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks so much. I found it fascinating, actually, as I left the military myself and went to Deloitte. The transition not only to, as you say, very much more matrix, very flat structure with a lot of youngsters, a tremendously young, very, very diverse, much more so than the military culture to go into. But the other thing I found, and I don't know whether you found the same thing, that there is a view, not only in Deloitte, but also with a lot of the clients I work with Deloitte, when they look at the military, they tend to think of us, if you like, as a very authoritarian. That's the culture. It's very hierarchical. And I don't think they necessarily appreciate exactly what you've just said, which is you do have to have a variety of different leadership styles to suit different modes. Is that the same in your experience?
Yeah, very much so. And by the way, I'd just say, we employ a lot of Deloitians, as we term them. I think at one point, someone said we had more Deloitians working for us than we had actually KKR core employees. And it's an exceedingly bright workforce, in addition to all the other attributes and qualities that you listed. But sure, yeah. Again, this idea that the military is just, again, salute smartly and do what you're told to do. Certainly there's a moment for that, but there's also an awful lot of moments where you want to sit with those you're privileged to lead and ask them their views. It's particularly true if they're out on the ground. I used to go out twice a week during the surge in Iraq and then in Afghanistan, on the calendar always, right after the morning update. We'd go out and I'd link up with a unit somewhere and would go on a patrol with them. And at the end of the whole time that we spent, which was many hours usually, I would sit down with just the company commander. So these are young captains, usually about anywhere from 5 to 8 years in service. They had all served in combat before by the time of the surge. They felt very keenly the responsibility for each of their soldiers, and they knew all their soldiers by face, not just by name or number. That's the last level of leadership at which that is generally true, as you know. And I would lay it on them that you guys owe it to me to tell me, to identify to me something that is really eating at you, that you have put up through your chain of command and hasn't been resolved. So it was the old, you're familiar with the sustain and improve. So this is, what do we need to improve? And by the way, they couldn't do me too. It'd only be about 4 or 5 of them in a tent usually, or command post or something at a time. And so they each had to come up with an independent issue that I needed to address, that the organization needed to resolve. And then there was usually a sustain that, if all of our resources got cut in half tomorrow, what do we have to continue to do? What is the absolute must sustain? These were very revealing sessions. And again, you're trying to create a culture of, again, learning, of constantly examining, reassessing, and sharing that with others, institutionalizing it wherever you can. So, yeah, I think the military is very different from actually the stereotype of somebody that dresses down somebody else in front of his desk at attention and orders him. That is all. And the guy does a swift about face, salutes, and leaves the office. That's not the case in most encounters, as you well know. And we actually actively tried to avoid that kind of situation. And again, to welcome ideas from those who were actually out there on the front lines. By the way, when I would finish that session with those company commanders, I would give them all my personal email address on the secure internet. And I said, if there is something that is really bothering you, it needs to really bother me, and it hasn't been resolved, you email me. And I used to get 2 or 3 of those a week as the course of that 19 and a half month tour played out.
Yeah, it's a great trust culture as well, if you can do that as well, with the sort of intermediaries in the command chain being content with that and accepting that as an approach, that you've got that kind of direct chain when you need it. But it is a bit of a break glass in case of emergency thing, I guess. I'm going to take you right back to the beginning, if that's okay. I want to basically get a bit of a sense of David Petraeus, the man, and what motivated you early on to join the army and to prepare yourself for a career that obviously took you through most of your working life.
Well, I think a lot of what we do in life is because we're trying to be like someone else. You'll be familiar with the old "be like Mike." We all admired Michael Jordan, and he's just a colossal figure. And for me, in addition to Mike, it was West Point graduates. I grew up in a town 7 miles from West Point, the U.S. Military Academy. Half of the people to whom I delivered a newspaper every morning when I was a kid for 2.5 long years in the bitter mornings of the Hudson River Valley, half of them were affiliated with West Point in some way. They were either West Point graduates, they were serving on the staff and faculty, they were West Point civilians, retirees, you name it. So the community was very much in the shadow of West Point in many respects. And I had a lot of admiration for those who went to West Point, who were the cadets at a given time, and then also to those who were the products of West Point. And I should just note that, for example, we used the West Point ski slope as our home ski slope. When I was in high school, we would have a lot of the championship games for different sports would end up being at West Point using their facilities because they were obviously a good bit bigger than the typical high school facility in our area. So it was a little bit natural in that regard that I would want to be like those that I admired. And that's why I ended up there. And then once I was there, I discovered that there's something really special about an institution. And here I'm not just talking about the U.S. Military Academy, but the U.S. Army, the U.S. military writ large, that puts a premium not just on one aspect of one's performance, but all three that are really important and have to come together. And that is the academic element of it, the cerebral, the intellectual component. There's obviously a very heavy premium on the physical component. That was especially true because I went into the infantry branch. And then there was a component about leadership. And I found that I enjoyed all three of these, and that this profession that values all three almost equally at various times. It depends on the position, obviously, which one of those is most important. And then I discovered that I'm actually pretty good at all of these. And so I'm in an institution that values three sets of qualities and attributes in which I've got pretty high level performance. In fact, there were only two in my West Point class, two of us who were cadet captains. That's a rank in the cadet hierarchy, varsity letterman, and starman. Starman is a top 5% academically. And so, I realized that this is a profession that values what I can bring, and I enjoy bringing it. And oh, by the way, it gives you opportunities along the way in your career path where, you get at a certain point in time, you've been under a rucksack for a while, you made a lot of night jumps, you're okay, walk to daylight again. And then all of a sudden they say, hey, but you can go to graduate school at Princeton. And then, about 2 years into that, you're about ready to get back to getting under a rucksack again. And you continue to get greater and greater leadership responsibilities. So all three of these just keep coming together. In fact, I might introduce here a model, an intellectual construct for strategic leadership that I used starting probably when I was between the three and 4-star tours in Iraq, and practiced very consciously. In fact, we ultimately, years later, when I was a part-time fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center, there was a team of graduate students, almost all of whom had worked for me, either in Iraq or Afghanistan, and led by a British former officer who wanted to distill this, actually. And we did. And we created a website at the Belfer Center. If you go to belfercenter.org and Google search for Petraeus and strategic leadership, it'll pop up. But the tasks of a strategic leader, really any leader, but critically for a strategic leader, because task one, as you'll see, is just vital. If you don't get it right, nothing else much matters. But these tasks are tasks that you actually do have to practice at any level of leadership. It's first get the big ideas right, understand the context, understand the situation, and then determine what the right strategy is to achieve your. The second is to communicate the big ideas, the strategy throughout the breadth and depth of the organization to all other stakeholders, et cetera, And of course, the higher you go, the more substantial the groups are with which you have to communicate that, not just internally, obviously, but also to the White House, number 10 Downing Street, the Iraqis, the Iraqi government, your partners, the world writ large. Number three is you have to oversee the implementation of the big ideas. This is what we normally think of as leadership. This is the inspiration, the energy, the example, the attracting the very best and brightest, retaining them, developing them, allowing some that don't measure up to move on to something else. It's the metrics they use. It's your battle rhythm. How do you spend your time in very considerable detail to ensure that you are engaging with all the different subordinate leaders, units, organizations, et cetera, that you have to drive the implementation of your big ideas, of your campaign plan, if you will. And then there's a fourth task, which is best done formally. You need to sit down. It should be on your battle rhythm. And it was during the surge in Iraq or Afghanistan or these other assignments. This is where you determine how you need to refine the big ideas to do it again and again and again. And there were a variety of action forcing mechanisms that we would schedule, including, for example, a monthly meeting for an hour with the colonels that were the leaders of the U.S. Army, U.S. Marine Corps, U.S. Special Operations Forces, lessons learned teams, the asymmetric warfare group leader, the counterinsurgency center director, all these individuals that were scouring the battlefield for potential lessons. But of course, the lesson's not learned until it's actually incorporated in the big ideas in some way, communicated, and then actually implemented. And again, the leader has to oversee all of that. So these four tasks, again, I'd like to think that over the years, I got reasonably good at determining what are the big five as a battalion commander or a brigade commander. All the way on up to what are the big ideas for the surge in Iraq, which of course you'll remember were 180 degrees different from what it was we were doing prior to the surge. Change leadership doesn't get any more profound than 180 degrees. And then, it turned out I could communicate pretty well. And again, I wrote reasonably well. I was a speechwriter for a Supreme Allied Commander, part-time for a Chief of Staff of the Army. I was his aide and also exec chef de cabinet, PSO, as I think you guys would say for our equivalent of the Chief of Defense Staff. And then, overseeing the implementation and, giving energy and all this stuff, again, seemed to be able to do that reasonably well. And then did firmly embrace the idea of a culture of learning. In fact, in the counterinsurgency field manual, which we developed between my 3- and 4-star tours in Iraq, and which we then implemented during the surge in Iraq, it was the guiding vision, the intellectual big ideas, if you will, the foundation. In that, we explicitly wrote the side that learns the fastest in such a conflict typically prevails. And I was determined that we were going to have a culture of learning for all different ways of doing that, including, as I mentioned, the sessions with the company commanders a couple of times a week, the sessions that I'd have with all the 2- and 3-star commanders once a week, the once a month division commanders and above, where every division commander, every 2-star and higher, had to give 2, if you will, lessons learned or initiatives or ideas that he or she had come up with that would be relevant to the others in the room. So you're fostering this kind, and it wasn't optional, and they knew it. So again, it will come back to these 4 tasks of a strategic leader, but they're really the tasks of any leader. The difference being that those below the strategic leader, the individual has to get the overarching strategy and big ideas right. Below that, everyone is operating within the left and right limits established by the big ideas that have been determined by the individual at the very top. They still have to come up with their big ideas for their organization, their strategy, again, within that intent, if you will, the construct established by the strategic leader. So we'll keep coming back to this and noting as well that this is, by the way, really applicable not just to leaders, not just to commanders or CEOs or what have you. This is applicable to those who support them. You mentioned, working for some individuals who are very close to the strategic leader at various times. And again, it's really critical that individuals that are in those positions. So I did a lot of special assistant, again, speechwriter, aide, exec, whatever, when I wasn't in command positions. And what you're doing is helping your particular leader, especially if he or she is a strategic leader, perform those four tasks well. And if, by the way, those aren't performed well, especially if the big ideas aren't correct, if the strategy is flawed, everything else is building on a shaky intellectual foundation. It's building on a foundation of sand instead of something that is rock solid.
Fantastic. And so much of that resonates as clearly with me. I think one of the things that developing on from that a little bit is the whole issue of empowerment. You sort of alluded to it with the strategic leader position and cascading downwards. But in my conversations I have with a lot of corporates, I do find occasionally that leaders going up the chain find it very difficult to delegate, find it difficult to let go, and they just accumulate more and more and more. Where actually, I think you and I have both been in a situation where you can't carry on doing that. You need to allow people the latitude to get on with it. And as you described, you set the boundaries and and let them work within the boundaries below. And I think that's such an important thing for a leader to be able to do, to turn around and empower people so they feel trusted, they develop, they get their own skill, build their own skill set along the way. And also that it doesn't overload you as the leader, because otherwise you're taking on too much and over time you just can't continue to do that. So no, really, really powerful stuff that you're coming out with there. Thanks.
No, look, I mean, empowerment, delegation of authority, and responsibility, of course, all of these kinds of ideas. But by the way, this comes back to leadership style, because if you understand each of those that you are empowering, what's interesting is that through my career, people would go to somebody, say, who was a brigade commander when I was a commander of the Great 101st Airborne Division during the invasion of Iraq in the first year there up in Mosul. And, one commander might say he had the really loose hand on the reins, light hand. He just sort of told us in general what we needed to do, and he let us go do it. And that was true for those who I assessed having the ability and the judgment, the ability, frankly, to perform the four tasks of a leader again, to get the big ideas right for their area, to communicate them effectively through their organization, oversee implementation, constantly determine how to refine them so you can do it again and again and again. There were some that did that brilliantly. There were some others who were asked, he could be a real micromanager. Well, I had that ability as well, but it was because in general, I felt that particular individual organization needed to be micromanaged. If you looked at the 9 infantry battalion commanders in that great division, and noting that we had as many aviation battalion commanders as well, as the biggest aviation fleet in the world, but the infantry were the ground owning units after all. And of those 9, 6 or maybe 7 really embraced what we needed to do for a comprehensive civil military counterinsurgency campaign. 2 to 3 of them did not. They really wanted to keep fighting, if you will. One of them was going out on raids every single night himself. And so we identified this, the assistant division commander for operations and myself and the brigade commanders. And I told the brigade commander for the individual that, I want to come down in a week. I want to hear the individual's comprehensive civil military counterinsurgency campaign, not how he's going out on raids every night and pursuing bad guys. That he needs to empower his people to do that. And so it went down, took that brief. By the time I got there, of course, the ADCO, the 1-star, the brigade commander, everybody else had been down there coaching, mentoring, helping the individual get it right. But again, you have to recognize those that just seem to get it. They have it, they feel it, they have the judgment. And then those that maybe don't. And those you have to provide a little bit more direction, a little more guidance, and a little bit more close monitoring and leadership.
Absolutely. Just taking that to an extra level in terms of leadership traits, leadership values, if you like, what are the things that you consider most important, yourself, but also to those you've led, that those who you've been following? So the ones that have been kind of all around you, I guess. What do you value most in that space?
Well, let's use that construct again for for leadership, first and foremost is essentially judgment. It's the judgment that now allows an individual, the brains, the intellect, the analysis, all of these capabilities that enable that individual to determine what the right approach should be, what the right big ideas are for his or her particular situation, mission, context, etc. Again, that is far and away the most important. Then, of course, you can then, how well does the individual communicate these? Then how well does the individual conduct the various tasks that are associated with actually implementing this, overseeing the implementation of this strategy, and then the capacity to learn and to do it all again and again and again. And, and in that overseeing the implementation, that again is really what we normally think of as leadership. We tend to skip over the getting the big ideas right, frankly, and then communicating them. When you go right to this, which is all about how well do you inspire? What's your example, leader of character, values, all these other elements that we will often populate lists of leadership qualities and attributes. But again, if you don't have the judgment component, and not everyone does. I mean, this is why there is a Peter principle, this concept that many people are promoted one level above their level of competence, and it usually has to do with that particular task. And again, let's keep in mind that we made lots of mistakes over the years in Iraq and Afghanistan in particular. We didn't even get the inputs right for Afghanistan until late 2010. And the credit for a lot of that goes to and I happen to be the commander by then, but it was really General McChrystal that set a lot of that into motion, and some of his predecessors. But by that, I mean, we didn't have the right big ideas. We didn't have the right strategy. We didn't have the right level of resources, certainly. We didn't have the right organizational architecture to implement the big ideas, the strategy. We didn't have the right preparation of our leaders. We didn't have the right preparation of our forces. We didn't have the right number of civilian elements that were supporting us, or which we were supporting in some cases. So again, this is not easy stuff. And as I mentioned, the surge in Iraq, we had to reverse the big ideas by 180 degrees against the desire of the Iraqi prime minister, I might add, and actually contrary considerably to those that we followed. Now, to be fair, the big ideas that we'd been following, those made sense until a certain set of developments transpired, which essentially plunged Iraq into a Sunni Shia civil war, from which you could not pull the country without doing what we ultimately did, which was leaving our big bases under which we'd been consolidating, preparing to go home, and going back into the neighborhoods, living with the people, because that's the only way you could secure them, partnering with the Iraqi forces, but taking back control from them for the security tasks, then actually recognizing that we needed to reconcile with as many of the enemies as we could, essentially the lower level Sunni insurgents and Shia militia, while intensifying the relentless pursuit with our special mission units of the leaders, the irreconcilable leaders of al-Qaeda in Iraq, the Sunni insurgent groups and the Shia militia, especially those supported by Iran. This is a massive change. And it was not easy. And again, in many cases, there was questioning about it. Our battalion and brigade commanders, in many cases, that really we're going to sit down with people who have our blood on their hands. They said, yep, that's one of the new big ideas. You can't kill or capture your way out of an industrial strength insurgency. By the way, I should note that my deputy commander, whom I'd asked Prime Minister Tony Blair to leave in place longer than was planned, to extend him, the great General Sir Graham Lamb, was instrumental in this. And the reason I wanted him extended was because he had had the experience in Ireland of sitting down across the table from Martin McGuinness's lads, or some of these guys that had, in his words, been swinging pipes at his lads just the week before. And I needed his help intellectually, together with General McChrystal and General Odierno, the two critical 3 stars at that time, to persuade our subordinate commanders that this is something we needed to do. And then it turned out pretty quickly, they realized once this started to happen, that this was a hugely important component of the overarching surge strategy.
Yeah, very interesting. Graham Lamb is a great guy. He when I was station commander Coningsby, he was a 2-star at that point, I think. And he came actually to go and fly in the Lancaster on the Battle of Britain Memorial flight, and so we did that on a Saturday, and it was I'll never forget. It was an amazing day. We went to Teesside to the unveiling of a memorial for a Victoria Cross winner. A Canadian Victoria Cross winner, actually, and there were some Canadians who'd flown in, and a whole collection of veterans that were there. And he was just amazing, particularly with the veterans. He was just an extraordinary character.
He's extraordinary.
Yeah, fantastic man.
He has all the qualities to perform these 4 tests brilliantly, and his communication skills are really quite exceptional. He can be both incredibly eloquent, thoughtful, earthy, occasionally sarcastic. He can pull all that together in a way that is extremely effective.
Looking at your sort of personal history and personal career, that you've obviously had a huge amount of real highs. What do you wish you could have done differently, though, and why?
Well, there's a number of things over the years, and I'm not going to get into the specifics of them. I think that the more instructive way to answer that is to recognize that life is not all high five moments. It's not all spiking the football in the end zone, to use our football analogy. It has setbacks. There are mistakes. There are shortcomings. Your organization's members will make colossal blunders and mistakes. You will do the same. And the question is, okay, what do you do then? If you've been knocked down in the ring or knocked yourself down, or the organization has been knocked back, what do you do? And I think what you do is you, number one, try to understand what happened, have a deep understanding of that, acknowledge it. If there need to be amends, then offer those, obviously, apologize, whatever. Salacia payments, in fact, that we used to make in Iraq and Afghanistan. But at a certain point in time, you got to get back on your feet, dust yourself off, pick up the rucksack, and start putting one foot in front of the other, and repeating the process, of course. So again, I think that's the real insight, if there is an insight, because all of us have dealt with, again, setbacks and disappointments and mistakes, again, whether they were our individual mistakes or, the sergeant that decided to use pages of the Quran for 25-meter targeting practice, which was quickly discovered by a local host nation Iraqi worker. And it was in the Iraqi prime minister's hands within, 30 minutes or something. And I mean, that was so significant that I apologized to him on camera. Obviously, we took a lot of steps to try to mitigate the chances of something like that happening again. And President Bush actually called him and apologized again publicly as well. So, but again, what do you do? What happened? How did it happen? Why did it happen? What do we need to do? Again, are there amends, apologies, what have you? What can we learn from this? How do we mitigate the chances of this happening again? And then let's get on with it and start again, rucking down the road again.
Yeah, and somebody said to me a long time ago, actually, it's not how hard you fall, it's how quickly you get back up. And I think that's absolutely right, isn't it? It's very much how you bounce back.
Graham Lamb, in fact, sent me a note one time. He said, never forget the old adage, don't tell me how high the guy jumped. Tell me how high he jumped back after getting knocked down.
Yeah, good one. Yeah. On the other side of that coin, so what do you consider across all of your years, and doesn't have to be necessarily a military thing, can be outside that as well, your most important achievement and kind of your legacy? What do you think you've left behind as a result of everything you've done?
Well, I think the legacy of any of us is the individuals that we've sort of touched, guided, mentored, perhaps inspired, And of course, it starts with your own family, your own children, your grandkids, and all the rest of this. And then it spreads out from there. And there's actually worked very hard over the years to mentor those that seem to be promising individuals. And perhaps I could help along the way, guide them and so forth. In fact, one of the joys of having a very senior position, say being a 4-star or the director of the CIA, or even to a degree what I'm privileged to do at KKR, is that you can help people. You're in a position to give them a hand, assistance, support, guidance, encouragement, etc. But then in a larger sense, I think it's, okay, what were the endeavors in which you were engaged? And, I was just unbelievably privileged to, I had 6 consecutive commands as a general officer. 5 of them were in combat. And the one that was not was the one where we overhauled every aspect of leader development, unit training, doctrine, organizational architecture, material requirements, et cetera, for counterinsurgency operations. That and included the counterinsurgency field manual, the only manual I think in Army and Marine Corps history published in less than a year. Jim Mattis was my co-conspirator in that particular endeavor. So again, these unbelievable opportunities. But at the end of the day, the one that I think was the most significant was the surge in Iraq, the command of that, because again, this was a country that was in a Sunni Shia civil war. It was spiraling downward very rapidly. When the month before I arrived back in Baghdad, as I recall, there were 53 dead civilian bodies due to violence every 24 hours. This is in the capital city. This does not include military, police, security force casualties. These are civilians killed, not just wounded or injured. So it was out of control what the Sunni extremists, insurgents, and then Shia militia were doing to their fellow Iraqis. And we were able to pull the country out of that civil war, to drive violence down by nearly 90% in the course of the 18 months during which we had the additional forces. And then to hand it off, if you will, to successors, and actually 2 of them. And over the subsequent 3.5 years, watch as the violence crept down even farther until tragically, right after our last 4-star left and our last combat forces, the Iraqi prime minister took actions of a very highly sectarian nature for political reasons and undid so much of what it was that we had sacrificed to achieve together. We tried to bring the fabric of society back together during the surge, kept it together for the subsequent 3.5 years. And of course, keep in mind that that time included my service as U.S. Central Command, which is overseeing Iraq and Afghanistan and the rest of the greater Middle East. And then, yes, Afghanistan, but then CIA, where again, I had a pretty good vantage point. So it was hugely disappointing to see what unfolded as Iraq unraveled, beginning with these incredibly sectarian acts. And just tragic to watch that. But Iraq has a new opportunity again now. Those institutions, many of them were shaken. The forces performed poorly in a lot of the areas in the face of the Islamic State. The new incarnation, they allowed al-Qaeda in Iraq to reconstitute. It became the Islamic State and so forth. But, again, touch wood, I'm somewhat hopeful that after now it must be at least 6 or 7 peaceful transitions of power, however long some of those have taken in the land of the 2 rivers, that there still is a tremendous opportunity for that country, given all the blessings that it has.
Fascinating. I must admit, this legacy thing is really interesting, isn't it, in the context of some of the conflicts? I was talking to someone the other day about Afghanistan. I served out there as well in 2008. I was the commander at Kandahar, running the airbase as the NATO commander. And I can remember thinking at the time, and actually talking to quite a lot of visitors, particularly political visitors, that the challenge was time. That it was really difficult to see how we would have the strategic patience to do what was the political demand was going to be. And then, of course, at the end, when we actually exited pretty rapidly and in a somewhat chaotic, I guess, being kind style, it was hard to look back on that, even though it was a long time previously about. And I was talking to someone about the fact that for me, I came back fully intact and had a very interesting, amazing tour, but tinged with tragedy, losing guys out there as well. And I just thought it was really hard for anyone that particularly had lost anyone. And I had a really interesting moment talking to a guy who had actually lost 2 legs in an IED explosion. And he said, no, I don't see it like that at all. The 20 years we spent there, if one kid gets a better education, if one woman has a better chance at a better life, maybe not now, but downstream, then that 20 years was worth it. And the injuries I suffered were worth it. And I thought that was really profound. I was amazed actually to get that kind of response from someone who had suffered so traumatically. So it's a really interesting debate to look back on, the effect we have long term, I think.
Yeah, no, and look, again, lots of mistakes, lots of shortcomings, lots of missteps, et cetera, along the way. But for the bulk of that 20-year period, an awful lot of Afghans were able to do things that they otherwise would not have been able to do and are not able to do now. Most specifically, for example, is just girls going to high school or much less to college, or women contributing to the society or engaging in the economy, and on and on. Again, that's not to say that there weren't lots of security challenges for those living, particularly in the rural areas, and you were in one of the tougher spots, although we actually did make enormous progress in Kandahar and Helmand during the period of the surge, if you will, the additional 30,000 U.S. and other NATO forces that were provided during the period, in fact, that I was privileged to command in Afghanistan. And I would contend as well that there were alternatives at the end of that 20-year period. And the best, in my view, would have been to continue what I believe was a sustainable commitment at that point in time, sustainability being measured in the expenditure of blood and treasure. We'd not had a single loss of life in combat, and I think in the final 18 months until that tragic suicide bombing outside the airport in Kabul. And the cost was really quite dramatically reduced. Yes, the security situation was fraught. Yes, the political and governmental situation were beyond frustrating, on and on. The corruption was terrible, et cetera. But again, I think that the lot in life for most Afghans, certainly those in the metropolitan areas, which is where the bulk of the people ultimately were living, was vastly better. The economy was vastly better. And you certainly didn't have half of the society that can't do what they were able to do then. And now essentially a return of that country to an 7th or 8th century interpretation of ultra-conservative Islam, being run by individuals, of course, that we fought against for the better part of those 20 years.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. Really, really interesting. Thank you. I'm going to dive backwards a bit and look at back at the historical context a bit. My father was a wartime Air Force pilot, flew Blenheims during the Second World War. And your father, I know, was in the Merchant Marine in the US. And I mean, sadly, my dad died when I was 3. So I mean, I can claim genetic links to get me into the military, but there's not much more than that because I don't really have any active memory of him. But how much did your father shape your transition into the military? You mentioned earlier on about living near West Point and that being a really big moment, but did you have much parental push into there as well?
I don't know about a push, but what was most significant with my father, who was a crusty old Dutch-American sea captain eventually, he had gone to the Dutch Merchant Marine Academy. He and his ship were at sea when the Nazis overran Holland in 1939 or whenever, and they couldn't go home back to Rotterdam, so they sailed up the coast of the United States, turned into New York Harbor and turned right into Brooklyn Navy Yard and said, we understand you're hiring. Because again, the U.S. Merchant Marine, which by the way took the highest per capita casualties of any service during that war, and the Merchant Marine during the war was regarded as a military service because they could churn ships out right and left, especially the Liberty boats that he was ultimately a captain on at the age of 29. So the problem was, of course, the U-boats, the battleships. Sometimes when you got close to Norway or whatever, the Nazi aircraft and so forth were just ripping these convoys apart. He did a Murmansk mission, for example. And of course, you could only do it during a few months of the year when the ice melted enough off the tip of Norway that you could actually get north of that in those days, and then into Murmansk in northwestern USSR. And his entire convoy had to scatter. They couldn't protect it. There were both U-boats and a battleship, the Scharnhorst. Half the ships reportedly were lost. He had a torpedo go underneath but not explode. It was a magnetic one, and it just malfunctioned. They want to explode underneath the spine of the ship and crack it so it'll sink within a couple of minutes. And of course, in the North Sea, you didn't survive much more than a couple of minutes, even in the summer. So again, an extraordinary set of experiences that he had had. Then they sailed to the Pacific, all around the world, and then he was a civil merchant mariner after that. And there's a certain quality, I think, that goes with being a ship's captain, especially a Dutch-American ship's captain, which is it's a combination of determination or stubbornness. And he would, if I came home from school with a report card or something like that, and it wasn't what perhaps it should have been, he'd just look at me and say, "Results, boy." He didn't want to hear excuses. He was not interested in what the mitigating circumstances were. It was about results. And both my parents were very, very avid readers, students of history. And, I felt like they were dragging me around all these different places. Yet it turned out that they were these vacations that we'd take where we would retrace the Paul Revere's ride or go to Concord and Lexington and the intellectual giants that were there, and walk Gettysburg, all of these different locations, that they were really inculcating a certain appreciation, not just of history, but of the values and principles and so forth that were demonstrated at these locations at formative times, in particular for the United States, but intellectually as well as, say, in military or other terms. I learned more about the whaling industry in those days than I ever wanted to. All I wanted to do is hang out at the motel pool and, see who might show up. And they'd be dragging me around Walden Pond one more time to see where, Henry David Thoreau lived and recall his various messages and so forth. But that turned out to be very instructive. But most of all, again, it was this results boy. And over time, I took that to heart and, did my best to try to produce results, whether it was, again, academically, athletically, or in terms of leadership.
They must have been immensely proud. How much of, or how far through your career did they see?
Well, my dad lived long enough to see me command the surge in Iraq. The last time I saw him was when I had just been nominated to command the surge. It was around New Year's of 2007 or 2006, 2007. And we were actually literally driving to see him from Los Angeles Airport. He was way out on the West Coast. We were at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. And on the way there, all of a sudden, my cell phone lit up. I could literally watch my email inbox just light up. And it was Secretary Gates trying to get hold of me and telling me that the president was going to nominate me to be the commander of the surge. Now, I'd had a lot of inklings that this was going to happen, but originally I'd been told probably to expect going back to Iraq in the summer of 2007. I ended up going back in early February. So at least he lived to see his son promoted to 4 stars, commanding the surge, watching it actually succeed. And then he passed away. Both my father-in-law, who was also a retired 4-star, someone I emulated in an awful lot of ways. He was a true soldier, statesman, scholar. But both of them died during my final tour in Iraq. And, I couldn't go back. You just had to stay out there.
Yeah, that must have been tough.
They delayed the actual funeral service until I got back in the case of my father-in-law. And it was a real privilege to march in uniform at the head of I'm sure you've seen these funeral processions in Arlington National Cemetery. with the riderless horse with the boots turned backward and pulling the case on to his burial site. It was a very moving experience and very important for the family. And by the way, he'd been the superintendent at West Point, the 3-star, the commander of West Point, if you will, during all 4 years that my class was there. So we'd actually made him an honorary classmate, given him a class ring and everything else. So there was even that aspect of that was very special.
Yeah, fantastic. He must have been so proud, and then both must have been so proud to see that. And I mean, results. You certainly got the results. So that's what an accolade to you. There must have been a bit of pressure when you were at West Point, actually, that you're dating the superintendent's daughter, though. I guess that's probably an added dimension.
That was it was a blind date. I didn't know who I was being fixed up with, and she actually didn't. She thought she was being fixed up with someone new, and it was a little bit awkward, to put it mildly. And then, I tried to keep it quiet for a number of months. I actually wouldn't allow them to announce the engagement until the final chain of command selections were. I didn't want somebody saying, the reason he ended up being a cadet captain on the brigade staff is because, he's marrying the boss's daughter. Which meant, by the way, then we couldn't find a slot in a chapel to get married for a month or so. But, life's little adventures.
Yeah, life's small challenges. Absolutely. So, I mean, looking back across all of that, then, if you could, it's a sort of slightly cliched question, and I'm sure you've been asked it plenty of times before, but if you were advising a school-age David Petraeus now, what would you be saying to him in terms of development?
There's sort of 3 realities, I think, or 3 bits of advice that I would offer to someone like that. I mean, first is to recognize and embrace the reality that life is a competitive endeavor. You don't get a trophy just for showing up. This is not little kids soccer where everybody gets the T-shirt. You get the T-shirt for being the best individually, and you also want to be the best team player as well. You certainly don't want to be the individual who earns the medal or what have you by climbing over the backs of your teammates. So again, that's bit of advice number one. And everyone doesn't actually acknowledge that. In some cases, that's very fine, but just then don't aspire to achieve beyond a certain level, because again, life's a competitive endeavor and you have to demonstrate excellence. Related to that is the admonition, never be proud to be average, or the analog, which is no one wants to be led by somebody who is proud to be average or who is satisfied with the gentleman's B or is too cool for school. Again, people want to be led by somebody who is achieving all the standards, is a standard bearer as well as a standard enforcer, who is leading from the front and has the capacity and capability to do that, whether it's physically, intellectually, or in more general leadership terms. And then finally, it would be to observe that luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. An awful lot of folks rightly said Petraeus was lucky. I was lucky. I mean, there is inevitably an element of timing in what happens in one's career, one's life. And I was lucky in that sense, except that I'd like to think I was also prepared for these opportunities as they came along, and that I'd spent a lifetime of study, application, commitment, all the rest of this to be prepared when the moment came. I actually took this very, very seriously. In fact, you'll appreciate that we were jumping at the former British airborne base, Aldershot, but we were jumping from balloons, which is hugely thrilling because it's literally straight down. There's no sideways motion. I mean, it's the ultimate roller coaster ride, if you will, and you jump from only 650 feet. So the ground rush is incredible. But so anyway, we made 5 jumps, I think, in the morning. There was a lieutenant, airborne regiment, parachute regiment lieutenant, who was my airborne buddy for all this stuff. And so we're done jumping. And he said, would you like to go, let's go to the pub. You need a cultural experience. It's part of, being here in the UK. And I said, sure, that'd be great. But on the way, could we stop at that military sales store that I saw outside the front gate? He said, yeah, sure. And so we went in. It was run by a former regimental sergeant major, actually. And so, he's our major. Let me introduce Lieutenant Petraeus here. He has a request. And he said, well, what is it, Lieutenant? What do you need? And I said, do you have any little used field marshal's batons? He said, oh, fresh out of those, mate. But I have a little swagger stick here, if that might do instead. The idea was, remember the saying Napoleon used to say that every corporal carries a field marshal's baton in his rucksack. And I wanted to put one of those in my rucksack so that every time I was rummaging around, I'd be reminded, you got to be ready to be field marshal. You have to prepare. Again, luck is what happens when preparation, commitment meets opportunity. So I took that little swagger stick and I actually tied it with that green 550 nylon cord with appropriate knots on either end and burned the frayed part. So nobody really knew that it was there on my rucksack, which was OD green in those days, except I did. And every time I lifted that rucksack, and it was with me for decades, I was reminded, you got to be ready. You need to commit to this stuff. You need to do all that you can so that if the moment comes, that you can indeed, pull that, rhetorically speaking, field marshal's baton out of your rucksack and do what you're required to do. So I think that's a really, really important element that and again, you don't do this casually. You have to really commit. You have to work hard. You have to focus. You have to make sacrifices. In many cases, your family sacrifice along with you, of course. I was gone for the better part of 7 of my last 10 years in uniform. I looked one time and I'd spent 8 of my final 4th of Julys in uniform overseas, outside the country. And thankfully had a wonderful family that managed to continue on, including a son who was the 2nd Lieutenant Rifle Platoon Leader in Airborne Unit when I was a commander in Afghanistan, and then went to Special Ops. So again, I think those 3 bits of advice about life being a competitive endeavor, never being proud to be average, and luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity, those capture an awful lot about the reality of life and what is necessary, I think, if you want to strive to achieve real excellence and at least to be ready for opportunities should they come your way.
Brilliant. I totally agree with you. And I think one of the things I find certainly to feature this side of the Atlantic, I'm not sure it is with you, that there is a move to take away that competitive piece and say, no, we need to be more equal opportunities. We need to, we don't want to see life as a competition, when reality is that all life's a competition. I couldn't agree with you more. I think it's such an important area to instill in people early on, that they need to be fighting for things that they want and really pushing by doing all the things you've just described. No, it's a fantastic answer. Thank you very much.
I mean, you have to do this again. Number one, you may discover you don't actually have what it takes. And then you have to, this is where we need to be careful, because we don't want to put so much pressure on particularly young people, so many rocks in their rucksack that, of course, that they end up sort of stumbling under that or falling under that or something like that. So I think it has to be carefully done. But those are the realities of life. They're the realities of one's career. And again, these kinds of aphorisms, I think, actually are quite effective. For what it's worth, in the counterinsurgency guidance that I issued as the commander of the multinational force in Iraq, and then something similar in Afghanistan, obviously for different context, it was a series of admonitions. And it started out, secure and serve the people. And then it would explain, you can only do that if you live with the people. And this is our job one. Without this, everything else is for naught. Promote reconciliation, explained what that was. Pursue the irreconcilables even more relentlessly. And it went on with it. There was one that said, walk, get out of your armored vehicle, take off your sunglasses, let the people actually see you and mingle with them. You can't be this remote figure if you are going to gain their confidence and their trust. And also, by the way, their information that they will give you once they realize you're actually going to stay in the neighborhood and finally try to get rid of the bad guys that have made life so miserable for them. And then there were two others that were fairly memorable as well. One of them was promote initiative. In the absence of orders, figure out what they should have been and execute aggressively. Because, of course, it's a small unit leaders war. And we need, as we've described earlier, you have to delegate, you have to empower. You have to make sure they understand your intent and how to translate big ideas at your level into concrete action at their level outside the wire, doing what only they can do, which is engage with the enemy and engage with the population. So again, those are important. And then there was one final one, which was having to do with dealing with the press. It said, be first with the truth. We want to beat the bad guys to the CNN Baghdad bureau after every raid in Sadr City or whatever else might be particularly sensitive or emotional or twisted by the bad guys. But we want to do it with the truth. And if it's a bad day, you go out and say, we had a very, very bad day. Here's what took place. Here's what we learned from it. Here's what we'll do in the future to try to reduce the chances of this happening again. So again, I think admonitions and these kinds of things can actually be quite effective. But again, I do think we have to avoid sort of overloading young folks in particular, while still trying to inspire them to be all that they can be.
Terrific. I can't have a guy like you with the experience you've got on this without looking forward as well. I know we're sort of aiming to focus around leadership stuff, but just a look at some of the geopolitical things that are out there at the minute. We've been through the Cold War. We've both been through the kind of hot wars that have followed in different guises. What's your sense of the level of sort of existential peril that we're facing right now?
Well, I think we face the greatest number of challenges, threats, and also the most significant threats, at least since the end of the Cold War, maybe since the end of World War II. And there's a good metaphorical image, I think, to illustrate this. Now, it's admittedly from a U.S.-centric perspective, but I think the response to these threats has to be U.S.-centric. In fact, the U.S. has to lead these. If the U.S. does not, no one else, frankly, will. So if you think of the U.S. as the guy in the circus who gets a plate spinning on a stick and then another one, and then pretty soon you have a whole tent full of plates spinning on sticks, noting that the guy has help from the U.S. allies and partners and others with whom we share values and ideals and principles. That tent, I think, has more plates in it than at any time in recent memory. And some of those plates are really, really serious. The most important plate, obviously, is that which captures the U.S./Western relationship with China. That's one we can't allow to wobble, much less fall on the ground. Obviously, there's a Russia plate that is more menacing than it was a couple of years ago, as menacing as it was then. There's still a North Korea nuclear and other threat plate. There's maybe multiple Iranian plates, one that represents their support to Shia militia, another that represents their missile program, and another, obviously, for the nuclear program. There are individual plates that represent individual Islamist extremist groups around the world that we still have to keep an eye and pressure on, because if we don't, they can reconstitute, as we saw happen when the Iraqi government and security forces took their eye off the Islamic State, and it was able to create the first ever caliphate, actually own ground in northern Iraq and northeastern Syria. There are various cyber threats that are very, very significant. You could argue that domestic populism in a variety of countries around the world is a big challenge, a growing challenge. There are actually criminal enterprises that are significant issues, especially in our own hemisphere. Mexico, enormously challenged by these kinds of developments. And then there's a whole variety of plates that really stem from developments associated with climate change, whether it's the increased desertification in the Sahel that have led to enormous migration of populace that have been displaced by these actions, individuals desperate to get to a better life, but creating a massive challenge say, for the Eurozone, for Europe in that regard. We have the same with our southern border and so forth. You have there will be water wars. There are already water skirmishes. You can see the extraordinary change in weather patterns, the severity of fires, you name it. All of these are challenges. We have to keep all these different plates spinning. The U.S. uniquely has to be the leader in many of these. Again, some of these plates, by the way, others will keep spinning with us maybe just helping them rather than leading it. And certainly many of these, there will be lots of folks all trying to help keep that particular plate spinning, especially if we value our alliances and partners and those with whom we share these ideals, values, and principles. But the bottom line is, again, most numerous threats and the most significant threats. Again, I think at least since the end of the Cold War and arguably the end of World War II.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think it's a really, really challenging time. And I think it's also, I know we don't want to go there, so we'll stay away from the political situation, but it's when I look at the politics in my country and the politics in yours, I mean, these are not easy times from the point of view of populism and political division, and trying to provide some sort of stable base to address all of that. So, yeah, it's really hard. We're coming towards the end, but I'm very conscious you've got a book coming out soon, which I'm very much looking forward to reading. And that takes us through history out to Ukraine. And looking at Ukraine, I mean, what's your sense of where that goes and how it all ends? Because I think it's still an area that is riven with uncertainty. You talked about bullish Russia. Russia clearly feels still very emboldened with some of the things that are going on. It's clearly got a strong hand in terms of its own ability to regenerate its defense industry and actually repopulate its army against obviously a pretty strong set of Western, if you will, sanctions, etc. But how do you think it's going to turn out?
Well, first of all, thanks for mentioning the book. It is, of course, Conflict: The Evolution of Warfare from 1945 to Ukraine, and I wrote it together with a great British historian and now Baron Roberts of Belgravia, Andrew Roberts. And it was really great fun. I've admired him for a very long time. I've done over a dozen events with him over the years, and it was a privilege to collaborate. It was his idea, I should note, and available for pre-order on Amazon. But, tell me how this ends. The question that I started asking on the way to Baghdad, actually as a two-star, when it was clear that a lot of the assumptions who had been provided were being invalidated one after another. I think, first of all, the only way you can really answer that question with respect to Ukraine is to say it depends. It depends on a number of different factors, not the least of which is the Ukrainians' ability to adapt to this very challenging situation they face in their summer and likely fall offensive. Where the depths of these minefields and fortifications and tank ditches and trench lines and all the rest of that are so substantial, and all of this is covered by the substantial amount of artillery that Russia can bring to bear. But I think they've adapted quite impressively, albeit, again, very, very hard, but a little bit like what we used to say about Iraq in the first 4 or 5 months of the surge. It's all hard all the time, but hard is not hopeless. It is hard, though. And I'll be back there in September to see, at least at a senior level, how it's going, having been there just recently in early June together with Andrew Roberts. So it depends on that. It depends on the continued support of the U.S., NATO countries, EU, especially when it comes to humanitarian and economic assistance, the UK, which has been such a tremendous supporter of Ukraine in a variety of ways and provided some of the most significant weapon systems, most recently the Storm Shadow, that has enabled Ukraine to shut down a number of these lines of communication that are so important from Russia to Crimea and then Crimea to the rest of Ukraine as well, to southern Ukraine. It depends on certainly developments in Russia, which is actually struggling to revive its military industrial complex. It's lost over half of its tank force, documented. Probably more than that. Actually, they're having to bring T-55 tanks out of mothballs, old World War II vintage stuff. And it depends very significantly on whether or not the Russian troops eventually crack and crumble. And we know that there's discontent in the ranks. We know that commanders have been relieved for complaining to their superiors that they didn't have enough counterfire radar, that their troops weren't being rotated off the line. You saw the whole issue with Prigozhin and his attempted rebellion until at least he was within 200 miles of Moscow when I think his senses returned. But you saw how Putin, in a way, capitulated to that. He doesn't want to lose Prigozhin's Wagner force capabilities overseas. So again, there's lots and lots of variables here. I hope that the way it ends is in a negotiated resolution that comes about as a result of Ukrainian successes on the battlefield that change the dynamic for Russia, that make Putin realize that he's not going to be able to outsuffer the Ukrainians, the Europeans, and the Americans, that the sanctions on his financial situation, economics, export controls, and so forth continue to be ratcheted down, that the ways they can circumvent sanctions get shut down to the extent that is possible, that all of this brings him to realize that this is not sustainable in the way that the USSR ultimately recognized after a decade that again, the war in Afghanistan was not sustainable. And they've taken many times the losses in Ukraine that they took in 10 years in Afghanistan. So hopefully a negotiated resolution. I'd like to see all of Ukraine liberated, including Crimea and the Donbass, if that is possible, but we'll see. And then with Ukraine on a path, a solid path to NATO membership, to EU membership, and with a huge reconstruction program, a modern day Marshall Plan, but several times because the requirements are actually much greater in Ukraine than they were back then, that is ongoing. And in fact, while we're at it, why not the implementation of the reforms that have long been needed in Ukraine when it comes to the judicial component, to governance, anti-corruption, reducing the monopolistic powers of oligarchs in certain sectors, land reform, et cetera. By the way, I raised this with President Zelensky when I was there last time, and we met with him, and he enumerated all the actions that Ukraine has taken in its parliament to establish laws, which he's approved, to deal with these long-standing issues. I mean, the reason he was elected was to carry out a number of reforms, but frankly, he was not able to do that in the first 2 1/3 years of his time as president. It was only after the war actually started, this latest invasion in February of last year, that he's been able to get the parliament to take these actions, sign them into law, and begin their implementation. But hopefully they will have been institutionalized by this time so that Ukraine becomes a magnet for outside investment as well as for reconstruction and humanitarian assistance.
Yeah, well, I hope you're right. I've got a long way to go until we get there. That's for sure, I think. And the cost is, as you allude to, is just immeasurable on both sides, actually.
But let's keep in mind, Ukraine sees this as their war of independence. This is about their survival as an independent nation. They are completely mobilized, completely committed. Their business folks are all engaged in helping government in some way. Every citizen that's left in Ukraine is seeking to help the effort to the extent that he or she can. And Russia is only partially mobilized. The burden is mostly on the ethnic and sectarian groups that are sort of outside the Moscow area. They're in the more far-flung places in that vast federation.
Yeah, I was actually on a session recently with a doctor he's a National Health Service consultant here, who helps out with WHO and other things, and was in Ukraine. And he was talking exactly to that point about the level of resilience and determination and focus amongst absolutely everybody in the population. I mean, not just those that have picked up weapons, but pretty much everyone. They do see it as a war of national survival, and it's really key.
And their innovativeness, their IT skills, their mechanical skills. They're the ultimate MacGyvers, to recall that old TV series that had this guy that could MacGyver his way to some kind of solution very creatively. And again, those are the attributes that have enabled them to win the battles of Kiev, Kharkiv, Sumy, Chernihiv, Kharkiv province, Kherson, etc. And I think that those will remain in place, and they will enable the Ukrainians to get through this to the point that one can get a meaningful negotiated resolution. Touch wood.
Yeah, no, fingers crossed. I totally agree. Touch wood. Last question. You've been amazingly generous with your time, and I am grateful to you. You've been interviewed so many times over the years. What's the most difficult question you've ever been asked?
I think it has to be, why can't Army beat Navy in football? But thankfully, a few years back, we finally did beat Navy after losing for nearly a decade. And that made that easier. I don't know. I mean, there's a number of tough ones out there. I mean, one that I just won't answer is, should we have invaded Iraq? I just think that it's inappropriate for the commander, who probably wrote more letters of condolence to America's mothers and fathers than any other, to offer an opinion on that one. And I'll just say I'm happy to leave that to the historians, to the pundits, to the critics, what have you. But again, you get plenty of tough questions, and I've had plenty of individuals challenge over the years, and certainly some of the more animated congressional hearings, shall we say, over those years. And in general, I used to feel, bring it on. I know something about Iraq. I know something about Afghanistan. I know something about counterterrorism, or you name it. Throw me your toughest question. So as a general matter, again, with a couple of exceptions where I think it's just not appropriate or unhelpful or not right, again, bring it on.
Fantastic. General, it's been an absolute privilege to talk to you on so many issues and in such depth. I am immensely grateful to you. I think you've shared some fabulous insights that I'm sure those listening to this will find immensely useful. So thank you so much.
Great to be with you, Bob. Thanks.
Thank you.